Winston Churchill would later admit something that few leaders dare to confess during wartime. Among all the terrors that the Second World War brought to his doorstep, among the bombs that fell on London and the armies that swept across continents, there was one threat that genuinely frightened him. Not merely concerned him or troubled his strategic calculations, but truly frightened him in a way that kept him awake at night. That threat came from beneath the waves, from the submarines that prowled the Atlantic like invisible executioners, severing Britain's lifeline to the world. The U-boat menace, he would say, was the only thing that ever really made his blood run cold. Yet even these wolves of the deep, these steel predators that had terrorized the seas with such impunity, would eventually learn what it meant to be afraid. Their fear would not come from the destroyers they had learned to evade, nor from the depth charges they had learned to endure. Instead, it would arrive on wings of wood, carrying fangs made of steel, descending from the sky with a fury that could end a submarine's existence in less than 20 seconds. There was a weapon, you see, that changed everything. A weapon so devastating in its simplicity, so terrifying in its execution, that U-boat survivors would speak of it in hushed tones for years afterward. They would describe how the sea itself seemed to transform into a slaughterhouse, how their mighty vessels of steel could be torn apart before they even had a chance to dive to safety. 18 seconds was all it took. 18 seconds between life and death, between command and catastrophe, between the surface of the ocean and the bottomless grave below. On the 23rd day of December in 1943, the Bay of Biscay stretched out cold and grey and utterly merciless beneath a winter sky. This was no ordinary patch of ocean. It had become a corridor of nightmares for the German submarine fleet, a passage they had to traverse to reach the open Atlantic from their fortified pens along the French coast. On this particular night, standing on the conning tower of U-128, Captain Werner Beck felt the bitter cold eating into his exposed hands as he raised his binoculars to scan the darkening horizon. His submarine was a magnificent piece of German engineering, 70 meters of predatory steel designed for one purpose alone, to hunt down and destroy Allied shipping. The U-boat was born to stalk convoys, to strike without warning, to vanish into the depths before retaliation could find it. Beck himself was a seasoned commander, a wolf of the Atlantic who had survived when so many of his comrades had not. But something had changed in the war. Beck could feel it in his bones, in the way his lookouts scanned the sky with increasing nervousness, in the way every surfacing felt less like a tactical maneuver and more like a desperate gamble with death. Each time his boat rose from the depths to breathe, to recharge the batteries that kept it alive, he was rolling dice with the universe itself. 18 minutes in the open air might mean survival, might mean his crew would live to dive another day, or it might mean annihilation, swift and brutal and final. The mathematics of submarine warfare had shifted dramatically and not in Germany's favour. High above the grey waters, far beyond Beck's sight or hearing, another hunter was closing in with mechanical precision. Squadron leader Charles Anderson sat in the cockpit of his aircraft, guiding it through layers of cloud with the practiced ease of a man who had flown these missions dozens of times before. To most observers, to anyone who might have glimpsed this plane in flight, it would have seemed an unlikely instrument of destruction. The de Havilland Mosquito was famously constructed not from metal, but from wood, from plywood and balsa held together with glue. Skeptics had dismissed it early in the war as too fragile, too unconventional, too reliant on materials that seemed better suited to furniture than fighters. They called it the wooden wonder, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with derision. But those who flew the Mosquito and those who faced it knew better. This aircraft was fast, almost impossibly fast. It could outrun nearly anything the Luftwaffe sent after it. It was nimble, capable of aerobatic maneuvers that heavier planes could never attempt, and Anderson's particular version of the Mosquito carried a secret that transformed it from a remarkable aircraft into something altogether more terrifying. From the nose of his plane jutted a weapon that defied conventional aviation wisdom. It was a 57mm cannon, the same type of gun that had been mounted on tanks and used to devastating effect against German armour on the battlefields of North Africa. This was no machine gun, no ordinary aircraft weapon designed to pepper targets with small-caliber rounds. This was a tank killer, a weapon meant to punch through hardened steel plate, now somehow mounted in the nose of a wooden aircraft. The very concept seemed mad, seemed to violate basic principles of physics and aeronautics. How could a fragile wooden airframe possibly absorb the massive recoil of such a weapon? How could such a cannon even be fitted into a space designed for bombs and machine guns? Yet British engineers had accomplished this seeming impossibility. The Mosquito Tsetse, as pilots had nicknamed it after the African fly whose bite brought death, was not just an aircraft anymore. It had been transformed into judgment made manifest, into a flying executioner that carried the power to destroy submarines before they could escape. Ultra-intelligence had betrayed the positions of the U-boats by decrypting their coded messages. Radar had evolved to the point where it could paint even the smallest targets against the vast emptiness of the ocean. And now, in the gathering darkness over the Bay of Biscay, Anderson's wooden wonder descended with silent, terrible purpose. 18 seconds. That narrow sliver of time stood between Captain Beck's command and either survival or utter destruction. 18 seconds separated the moment when a lookout might cry out in alarm from the moment when a 70-ton submarine could complete its crash dive and disappear beneath the waves. 18 seconds was the difference between the roar of a shell ripping through steel and the relative safety of the deep. Beck gripped the icy rail of his conning tower, unaware that death was diving toward him at over 300 miles per hour. Anderson's finger tightened on the trigger mechanism, his eyes locked on the pale wake far below that betrayed the submarine's position. The ocean itself seemed to sense the coming violence, seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. This was the new reality of the Battle of the Atlantic. Steel against wood, but wood armed with weapons that could tear steel apart. Depth against sky, but sky equipped with eyes that could penetrate darkness and weapons that could strike with surgical precision. Predator against predator, but the balance of power had shifted in ways that the U-boat commanders were only beginning to understand. Only one would emerge from this encounter alive and intact. And in those 18 seconds that hung suspended between the present and the immediate future, the course of history itself was about to be rewritten in fire and blood and seawater. The Battle of the Atlantic had never been merely a contest between ships and submarines, between convoy escorts and wolf packs. From the very beginning, it had been something far more fundamental and far more desperate. It was a war fought over hunger, over fuel, over time itself. Every ton of shipping that reached British ports meant food for the civilian population, oil for the machines of war, weapons and ammunition for the armies that would eventually storm back into occupied Europe. Every convoy that was destroyed meant Britain edging closer to starvation, closer to industrial paralysis, closer to the point where continuing the war would become impossible, regardless of will or courage. In the terrible year of 1942, Admiral Karl Dönitz's U-boat fleet prowled the oceans like a plague sent to strangle Britain slowly but surely. Convoys burned throughout the long winter nights, their cargo spilling into frigid waters, their crews dying by the hundreds. Oil slicks spread across the black surface of the Atlantic like infected wounds. Survivors clung desperately to shattered timbers and overturned lifeboats, their screams gradually swallowed by the indifferent sea. The wolf packs, operating with coordinated precision that seemed almost supernatural to their victims, had transformed the Atlantic Ocean into their personal hunting ground. And the Allies, for all their industrial might and determination, were bleeding out ship by ship, sailor by sailor, ton by ton. Winston Churchill, that master of rhetoric who had rallied Britain through its darkest hours, would later look back on this period with a candour that was unusual even for him. His voice marked by fatigue and residual fear, He would admit that of all the manifold dangers that threatened Britain during the war, only one had truly frightened him to his core. It was not the Luftwaffe raining bombs on London night after night, turning neighbourhoods into infernos and burying families beneath rubble. It was not even Hitler's seemingly unstoppable armies pressing deep into Russia, threatening to knock the Soviet Union out of the war entirely and free up unlimited German forces for other fronts. No, the thing that made Churchill's blood run cold was the invisible menace lurking beneath the waves, the silent threat that could sever Britain's lifeline to America and doom the island nation to slow defeat through isolation and starvation. The U-boat peril represented an existential threat that no amount of courage or eloquent speeches could overcome. It was a mathematical problem, a race between destruction and construction, and for much of 1942, the Germans were winning. Dönitz's strategic doctrine was as simple as it was brutally effective. The admiral understood that Germany did not need to sink every single Allied ship. They merely needed to sink tonnage faster than the Allied shipyards could replace it. If German submarines could destroy merchant vessels and tankers more quickly than American and British workers could build new ones, eventually the equation would tip in Germany's favour. The convoy system would collapse under its own weight. Britain would run out of food, oil and ammunition. The war would effectively be over without Germany ever having to successfully invade the British Isles. It was a numbers game played with steel and blood, and in those early years of the conflict, the numbers told a story of impending catastrophe for the Allied cause. Entire convoys vanished into the depths during this period, sometimes with shocking speed and efficiency. Merchant ships laden with vital supplies, tankers carrying fuel that could never be recovered, troop transports filled with soldiers who would never see combat, all were fed to the wolves that circled beneath the waves. By the end of 1942, Allied shipping losses had reached levels that were genuinely terrifying to anyone who understood the strategic implications. There were months when nearly 1 million tons of shipping was destroyed, blown apart or torpedoed or sent to the bottom by mines. The scale of destruction was almost impossible to comprehend, representing not just ships and cargo, but thousands upon thousands of lives lost in the cold waters of the Atlantic. The men who went down with these vessels died hard deaths, either killed instantly by explosions and fire or left to slowly freeze in lifeboats and rafts, waiting for rescue that often never came. The Allied response to this carnage was, at first, hamstrung by outdated thinking and limited resources. Escort destroyers and corvettes sailed at the edges of convoys, doing their best to protect the vulnerable merchant ships, but they were fundamentally defensive weapons operating under defensive doctrines. They were tethered to the convoys they protected, unable to chase too far after submarine contacts for fear of leaving the freighters exposed to attack from other directions. They defended admirably, often with great courage and skill, but they did not hunt. They reacted to U-boat attacks rather than preventing them. And so the submarines struck again and again with impunity, confident in their tactical superiority, increasingly smug about their chances of survival. The U-boat crews developed a swagger, a sense of invulnerability that came from repeated successes and the knowledge that the odds heavily favoured them in any given encounter. But the seeds of their eventual downfall were already being planted, even as the wolf packs enjoyed their greatest triumphs. Steel supremacy, that doctrine of overwhelming firepower and defensive protection that the U-boats embodied, carried within itself a fundamental weakness. The Germans had created a system that worked brilliantly as long as they maintained certain advantages: surprise, concentration of force, and the vast empty spaces of the Atlantic to hide in. But the Allies were not passive victims accepting their fate. They were learning, adapting, innovating with a speed and creativity that would eventually transform the entire character of the battle. The British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had achieved what many considered impossible. They had broken the German Enigma encryption system. The crackling wireless messages that U-boats sent back to their headquarters, reporting positions and successes and receiving new orders, were no longer secret. Allied intelligence could read them almost as quickly as the intended German recipients. This meant that convoy routes could be adjusted to avoid known U-boat patrol lines. It meant that hunter-killer groups could be directed to likely interception points. It meant that the fundamental advantage of the submarine, its ability to appear without warning from the empty ocean, was being systematically eroded by intelligence that turned the hunters into the hunted. Simultaneously, technology was evolving at a remarkable pace. The Allies developed new eyes that could penetrate the darkness that had always been the submarine's ally. Radar systems grew smaller, more powerful, more discriminating. They could detect a submarine's conning tower against the clutter of wave returns. They could paint a periscope at ranges that gave defending ships time to react. Sonar systems turned the ocean itself into a traitor, bouncing sound waves off submarine hulls and revealing their positions to anyone listening with the right equipment. The technological edge that had once favoured the stealthy submarine was shifting, slowly but inexorably, toward the surface ships and aircraft that hunted them. By the middle of 1943, the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic had begun to turn in ways that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. The convoys that crossed the ocean no longer sailed with just defensive escorts trailing along behind. Now they were accompanied by purpose-built killers, ships and aircraft designed not primarily to defend, but to hunt down and destroy submarines wherever they could be found. Escort carriers, small and slow and ungainly but deadly in their purpose, began to appear in increasing numbers. These converted merchant hulls carried aircraft far out into the Atlantic, extending air cover to regions that had previously been beyond the reach of land-based planes. The notorious mid-Atlantic Gap, that area where submarines had operated with near-total impunity because no aircraft could reach them, began to close as escort carriers provided continuous air patrols. Destroyer escorts proliferated, smaller and cheaper than fleet destroyers, but armed with the latest submarine hunting equipment. They carried depth charges in abundance, and increasingly they mounted hedgehog mortars, forward-throwing weapons that could blanket an area with explosive projectiles before the submarine even knew it was under attack. These ships worked in coordination with aircraft, sharing information, driving submarines down and keeping them submerged until their batteries died and they had to surface into waiting arms. Intelligence provided the initial vector, technology provided the tracking capability, and doctrine wove everything together into an increasingly effective net that grew tighter with each passing month. For the U-boat captains who had once ruled the waves with such confidence, the world was shrinking around them in ways both literal and psychological. Every surfacing became a calculated risk rather than a routine operation. Every shadow on the horizon might be death approaching at speed. The Bay of Biscay, that vital corridor from the French submarine pens to the open Atlantic, transformed from a safe transit route into a gauntlet of terror. Coastal Command aircraft circled overhead constantly, their radar pulses sweeping through the night, detecting submarines that thought they were hidden by darkness. Even the ocean, which had been the U-boat's natural element and greatest ally, now seemed to betray them as Allied sonar grew more sensitive and more widespread. Yet despite all these improvements, one crucial problem remained frustratingly unsolved. Depth charges were brutally effective when they detonated close enough to a submarine, but they were fundamentally imprecise weapons. They had to be dropped in patterns, hoping that at least some would explode near enough to the diving submarine to cause fatal damage. More often than not, they would damage but not destroy, cracking hull plates and causing leaks, but allowing the submarine to limp away and survive to fight another day. Bombs dropped from aircraft faced similar limitations. They had to be released at exactly the right moment to fall near a rapidly diving target. Too early or too late, and they would explode harmlessly in the water while the submarine escaped into the depths. Submarines that were caught at shallow depths and subjected to attack often survived, scarred and battered but fundamentally intact, their pressure hulls designed to withstand enormous punishment. What the Allies desperately needed was a weapon that could strike instantly and decisively, that could guarantee a kill rather than merely inflicting damage that might or might not prove fatal. They needed something that could punch through a submarine's armoured hull in the brief window of time before it could dive to safety. Something with the precision to hit a specific target and the power to ensure that target did not survive the encounter. The answer to this need was still in development, still being refined in workshops and testing grounds. But when it arrived on the scene, when it finally proved itself in combat, it would transform the nature of anti-submarine warfare as completely as radar and sonar had done before it. That answer would not come from the traditional sources of naval power. It would not be a bigger depth charge or a more powerful bomb. It would not even be made primarily of steel. Instead, it would be born from wood, from the fragile plywood construction of an aircraft that seemed far too delicate to carry such a devastating weapon. It would be a weapon that could reach out and touch a submarine with lethal force before the submarine's captain even fully understood he was under attack. It would be a weapon feared more than destroyers, more than depth charges, more than anything else the Allies had yet deployed. It would be a weapon that could kill in 18 seconds, and when it arrived over the Bay of Biscay, the wolves of the Atlantic would finally understand what true fear felt like. Their age of dominance, their time as the masters of the sea, was rapidly approaching its end, though many of them did not yet realize how thoroughly the rules of engagement had changed. By the time 1943 rolled around with its promise of changing fortunes, the Atlantic Ocean had been transformed from a simple battlefield into something far more complex and deadly. It had become a three-dimensional chessboard where the Allies were finally learning to think multiple moves ahead, anticipating German actions and positioning their forces to maximum advantage. The old doctrine of passive escort defense, of simply trying to protect convoys from attack, had been abandoned as insufficient and ineffective. In its place rose a new philosophy, something more aggressive and fundamentally more merciless in its execution. This was the birth of the hunter-killer system, a coordinated approach that turned the tables on the U-boats and transformed them from predators into prey. At the heart of this new system stood the escort carrier, ungainly and unimpressive to look at but deadly in its operational purpose. These ships were small compared to fleet carriers, slow compared to cruisers, and had been converted from merchant hulls that were never designed for military operations. Yet they carried something the convoys had desperately needed: air power at sea, far from land bases, operating continuously in areas where submarines had once been untouchable. Each escort carrier held a modest complement of aircraft, usually Grumman Avengers armed with depth charges and torpedoes, and Grumman Wildcats for fighter protection. These planes could patrol hundreds of miles around the convoy, could search vast expanses of ocean that would be impossible to cover from surface ships alone. They could force submarines to remain submerged where they were slow and nearly blind, and they could attack with weapons that grew more sophisticated with each passing month. Surrounding the escort carriers circled the destroyer escorts, purpose-built submarine hunters armed with the latest detection equipment and the most effective weapons yet devised for anti-submarine warfare. These ships carried sonar that could track submerged contacts over considerable distances, depth charges that could be rolled off racks or thrown to the sides to create deadly patterns, and increasingly they mounted the Hedgehog mortar, a forward-throwing weapon that launched 24 projectiles in an oval pattern ahead of the ship. The Hedgehog had a crucial advantage over traditional depth charges. Its projectiles only exploded on contact with something solid, which meant that if you heard an explosion, you knew you had hit the submarine. There were no false alarms, no uncertainty about whether the target had been destroyed or merely shaken. Together, the escort carriers and destroyer escorts formed roaming execution squads that no longer waited passively for U-boats to attack. Instead, they actively hunted submarines across vast expanses of ocean, using intelligence to position themselves where U-boats were likely to be, and then prosecuting contacts with a thoroughness that few submarine crews survived. These hunter-killer groups operated independently of specific convoys, free to pursue contacts as far as necessary, free to spend days stalking a single submarine if that's what it took to confirm a kill. They represented a fundamental shift in naval warfare doctrine, from defense to offense, from reaction to proactive engagement. Admiral Dönitz's submarines, which had once been able to slip through enormous gaps in the Allied defensive network, now found themselves hunted by machines and men they could not escape. The Enigma encryption system, which had protected their communications and allowed coordinated wolf-pack tactics, had been thoroughly compromised. The ultra-intelligence program meant that Allied codebreakers could read German naval messages almost as soon as they were transmitted. This intelligence revealed U-boat patrol lines with devastating accuracy. It showed where submarines planned to refuel from the specialized supply U-boats known as milk cows. It exposed their operational areas, their planned attack positions, their very breathing spaces in the vast ocean. The hunters of yesterday found themselves dragged into ambush after ambush, betrayed by the electronic silence of the ether that they thought protected them, never knowing that their most secret communications were being read by their enemies. Nowhere was the transformation more dramatic and more consequential than in the skies above the Atlantic. The Royal Air Force's Coastal Command had begun the war as little more than a defensive screen, flying patrols with obsolete aircraft and limited effectiveness. Liberators and Sunderlands had lumbered through the air on interminable patrols, dropping depth charges when they encountered submarines, but often arriving too late to prevent attacks or achieve kills. The aircraft were too slow, their weapons too limited, their coordination with surface forces too haphazard to be truly effective. U-boat captains had learned the patterns of air patrols and adapted their behavior accordingly. They dove quickly when aircraft appeared, surfaced under cover of darkness to recharge their batteries, and generally treated aircraft as more of an inconvenience than a genuine threat. The Bay of Biscay had become the critical artery for German submarine operations, a narrow corridor that every U-boat had to transit when leaving the heavily fortified pens at Lorient, Brest and Saint-Nazaire on the French coast, or when returning from patrol. This natural choke point represented an enormous opportunity for the Allies. If they could effectively close that artery, if they could make the passage so dangerous that U-boats could not reliably get through, then the submarines would be effectively trapped or forced to take circuitous routes that consumed time and fuel. The German submarine campaign would suffocate under the weight of its own operational limitations. Coastal Command underwent a radical transformation to exploit this opportunity. It would no longer content itself with simply patrolling and reacting to U-boat sightings. Instead, it would strike proactively, aggressively, relentlessly. The slow patrol bombers that had characterized early operations gave way to faster interceptors that could respond quickly to intelligence reports. Radar technology shrank in size while simultaneously growing enormously in power and precision. The new centimetric radar systems operated on wavelengths so short that German receivers could not detect them, which meant U-boats had no warning they were being tracked. This radar could paint even the smallest targets against the background clutter of the sea, could detect a periscope cutting through the waves, could find a conning tower in darkness or fog. Combined with improved tactics and better weapons, this technology made invisibility an illusion. The ocean, which had once been a hiding place where submarines could disappear into vast emptiness, now became a brightly lit stage where every movement was visible to Allied eyes above. Yet for all these improvements in detection and tracking, the problem of achieving a certain kill remained frustratingly persistent. Depth charges dropped from aircraft certainly could damage submarines, could crack pressure hulls and cause flooding, could sometimes force a submarine to surface where it could be finished off by gunfire or additional attacks. But too often the steel predators survived these attacks. They would dive deep, absorb the punishment, perhaps leak and strain, but ultimately endure. They would limp back to port for repairs, their crews shaken but alive, the submarine itself damaged but rebuildable. The fundamental problem was that depth charges were area weapons, relying on blast effects transmitted through water to crush or crack the hull. They needed to explode very close to the target to be effective, and getting that close against a rapidly diving submarine was more a matter of luck than skill. What the Allies needed desperately was not another variation on the depth charge concept. They needed something fundamentally different, something that could deliver a direct kill before the submarine had time to dive to safety. They needed a weapon that could pierce a submarine's heart in a single blow, that could punch through the pressure hull with enough force to guarantee catastrophic flooding and certain destruction. This was the gap that gnawed at the minds of strategists and planners throughout 1942 and into 1943. They had solved so many problems: detection through radar, tracking through sonar, intelligence through code-breaking, coordination through improved communications and doctrine. But the final piece, the killing blow, remained elusive. Imagine the tactical situation from the perspective of both sides. A U-boat surfaces to recharge its batteries in the gathering dusk over the Bay of Biscay, its captain confident that darkness will provide some protection from patrolling aircraft. The submarine's diesel engines rumble to life, feeding power to depleted battery banks, giving the crew a chance to breathe fresh air after hours submerged in the fetid atmosphere of the pressure hull. The captain knows he can dive within 30 seconds if threatened, knows that his submarine is designed to crash dive as quickly as any ship afloat. Then an aircraft spots the submarine, either visually or through radar. In those precious seconds, the difference between survival and destruction is measured not in bombs dropped hopefully into the vicinity of the target, but in shells driven straight through the conning tower or pressure hull before the submarine can escape. The aircraft has perhaps one pass, one chance to strike before the submarine disappears beneath the waves. Traditional weapons often failed to capitalize on this fleeting opportunity. The question that emerged from analyzing this tactical problem was both simple and revolutionary. What if you could give an aircraft the striking power of a tank? What if a weapon designed specifically to shatter the armor of German panzers could be turned against the steel hulls of submarines? The idea seemed almost absurd at first consideration. Aircraft were designed for speed and maneuverability, not to absorb the massive recoil forces generated by large-caliber weapons. The entire structure of a plane had to be kept as light as possible to achieve the performance characteristics that kept it alive in combat. Adding a heavy weapon with enormous recoil seemed to violate fundamental principles of aircraft design. Yet desperation has a way of breeding audacity and innovation. In the meeting rooms of the Air Ministry, where senior officers and civilian experts wrestled with the problem of how to definitively kill U-boats, someone pointed out that the British Army had already developed a weapon that might be perfect for this application. The QF 6-pounder gun, officially designated as a 57mm cannon, had proven itself repeatedly against German armour. It could penetrate the frontal armour of a Panzer IV, could damage even the mighty Panther tank under the right conditions. Its shells were designed for one purpose: to punch through hardened steel plate and create devastating effects on the other side. If such a weapon could rip open the hide of a Panther tank, why couldn't it do the same to the pressure hull of a U-boat? This was the seed of the weapon that would eventually terrorize the Bay of Biscay and haunt the nightmares of U-boat commanders. Not a bomb that exploded near the target, not a torpedo that might miss, but a gun that could fire armor-piercing shells directly into a submarine at point-blank range. A cannon that would be aimed like a rifle rather than dropped like a bomb, giving the attacking aircraft precision that had never before been possible in anti-submarine warfare. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity, but the engineering challenges were enormous. How do you mount a weapon weighing over half a ton in the nose of an aircraft without destroying the plane's performance? How do you manage recoil forces that could literally tear a fragile airframe apart? How do you feed ammunition to the gun in the cramped confines of an aircraft fuselage? The solution would require innovation and engineering brilliance. The weapon would not be mounted on a lumbering patrol bomber that could barely defend itself. It needed to be installed in a machine that was fast enough to survive encounters with German fighters, nimble enough to make precise attack runs at low altitude, and reliable enough to operate over the hostile waters of the Bay of Biscay, hundreds of miles from friendly bases. The answer to these requirements lay not in conventional metal construction, but in an aircraft built from an unconventional material that skeptics had doubted from the beginning. The de Havilland Mosquito had earned its reputation as the wooden wonder through sheer performance that silenced critics who had initially dismissed it as too fragile for combat. Built primarily of plywood and balsa wood, bonded with special adhesives and shaped into an aerodynamic form that was both beautiful and efficient, the Mosquito had proven capable of outrunning nearly anything the Luftwaffe could send against it. It could carry bombs deep into German territory, could perform photographic reconnaissance over heavily defended targets, could intercept enemy aircraft and fight them successfully despite carrying no defensive armament. The secret of its success lay in pure speed and agility. In 1943, the Mosquito was about to be given yet another identity, one that would prove as important as any of its previous roles. It would cease to be merely a bomber or a scout or a fighter. It would be transformed into an executioner, a flying weapon platform specifically designed to kill submarines before they could escape. The hunter-killer doctrine had prepared the net that would trap U-boats. Intelligence operations had revealed where the prey could be found. Technology had built the spotlight that would illuminate them against the darkness of the sea. Now all that remained was to forge the blade that would deliver the final decisive blow. And that blade was about to be carved into the nose of a wooden aircraft that would become the stuff of German nightmares, a ghost that appeared without warning and disappeared just as quickly, leaving behind only wreckage and survivors who whispered that the sea itself had turned against them. The birth of the Mosquito Tsetse was not an elegant process of careful design refinement and methodical testing. Instead, it was an act of engineering defiance, a deliberate choice to attempt something that conventional wisdom suggested was impossible. The engineers at de Havilland and the various military establishments involved in the project were told, in no uncertain terms, to do the impossible. They had to take 1/2 ton of cannon designed for use on the ground, bolt it into the nose of a wooden aircraft that weighed less than 7 tons empty, and somehow make the whole contraption not only flyable but combat effective. The weapon in question was the British QF 6-pounder, a 57mm tank killer that had earned a fearsome reputation on the battlefields of North Africa. This gun had proven itself against Rommel's panzers, punching through armour that had turned aside smaller weapons. In the grinding tank battles around Normandy after D-Day, it would acquit itself well even against heavier German armour. The shells it fired were designed with one purpose: penetration through hardened steel plate. The concept of mounting such a weapon in an aircraft seemed to violate multiple principles of aircraft design simultaneously. The gun alone weighed approximately 500 kilograms, a substantial portion of the Mosquito's total payload capacity. But weight was actually the least of the problems the engineers faced. Far more challenging was the issue of recoil. When a 6-pounder fired, it generated enormous rearward forces that, in a tank, were absorbed by tons of armor plate and suspension systems specifically designed to handle the shock. In a wooden aircraft with no such mass to absorb the recoil, that same force threatened to shake the plane apart or at minimum throw it violently off course, making any kind of accurate shooting impossible. To make this work, the Mosquito's nose had to be completely redesigned and strengthened. Where once there had been machine guns and bomb racks and space for a bombardier, now there would be nothing but gun and ammunition and the complex mechanical systems needed to make everything work. The engineers stripped the nose section down to its structural fundamentals and then built a cradle of steel inside the wooden shell. This internal structure was essentially a skeletal frame strong enough to hold the cannon rigidly in place while simultaneously distributing the recoil forces through the aircraft's entire forward structure rather than concentrating them at a single point. Multiple attachment points ensured that when the gun fired, the forces would be spread across reinforced bulkheads and frame members, allowing the wooden structure to flex slightly and absorb the shock without cracking or failing. The result was something that looked oddly predatory even when sitting on the ground. The long barrel of the 6-pounder jutted from the Mosquito's nose like a spear, giving the aircraft an aggressive, purposeful appearance that was quite different from the elegant lines of standard Mosquito variants. In profile, the cannon-armed version looked almost grotesque, as though someone had grafted the snout of a weapon onto an aircraft never meant to carry it. When the trigger was pulled and the gun fired, the entire plane shuddered violently. Pilots reported that the recoil felt like being kicked in the back by a giant, that the aircraft seemed to hesitate in mid-air as if shocked by its own firepower. But the wooden structure held. The glue joints that skeptics had worried about did not fail. The plywood skin did not split. British engineering and Canadian craftsmanship had combined to create something that worked despite seeming like it shouldn't. Feeding ammunition to the gun presented another significant challenge. In a tank, the 6-pounder was served by a human loader, a crew member whose sole job was to grab shells from storage racks and ram them into the breech as quickly as possible. This manual process worked well enough in the relatively spacious interior of a tank, but in the cramped fuselage of an aircraft, there simply wasn't room for an additional crew member to manually load the weapon. The solution was an automatic loading system, a mechanical arrangement that drew shells from a magazine and fed them into the breech without human intervention. This system was complex, requiring precise tolerances and reliable mechanisms that could function under the vibration and G-forces of combat flying. When it worked properly, it allowed the gun to fire multiple shells in rapid succession, creating a brief but devastating barrage. The magazine held 25 rounds, a mix of ammunition types chosen for maximum effectiveness against submarines. The shells themselves came in two primary varieties. Armor-piercing rounds were capped with hardened steel noses designed to bite into metal and punch through rather than shattering on impact. These were the killers, the shells that would turn a submarine's pressure hull into torn scrap metal. High-explosive rounds were also carried, intended to deal with targets on the submarine's deck or to create additional damage after the armor-piercing shells had already opened the hull to the sea. The combination gave pilots flexibility to adapt their fire to whatever situation they encountered, though in practice the armor-piercing rounds proved so effective that they became the preferred ammunition for nearly every engagement. Thus was born the de Havilland Mosquito FB Mark 18, though very few people called it by its official designation. To the pilots who flew it and the ground crews who maintained it, it was the Tsetse, named after the African fly whose bite transmitted sleeping sickness and death. The comparison was grimly appropriate. The Tsetse fly was small, easy to dismiss, but carried death in its bite. So too did this wooden aircraft carry a sting that was utterly disproportionate to its size and seemingly fragile construction. What had been a versatile and successful aircraft was now transformed into a highly specialized predator with a single purpose: to hunt submarines and kill them before they could escape. In the air, the Tsetse presented a strange and almost disturbing appearance to observers who were familiar with standard Mosquito variants. The sleek lines that had made the Mosquito such an aesthetically pleasing aircraft were disrupted by the massive cannon barrel protruding from the nose. The balance looked wrong, as though the aircraft was nose-heavy and ungainly, but appearances, as so often happens in warfare, were deeply deceiving. Once airborne and accelerating, the Tsetse flew with the same speed and agility that had made the Mosquito famous. The added weight and altered balance were compensated for by minor trim adjustments, and within moments of takeoff the aircraft handled just like any other Mosquito. It could still cruise at over 300 miles per hour, could still turn tightly when needed, could still climb rapidly to escape danger or dive steeply to attack. The only difference was that now, when it stooped upon a target like a falcon striking a rabbit, it carried not merely sting but annihilation. For the crews of U-boats transiting the Bay of Biscay, the appearance of the Mosquito Tsetse marked the beginning of a new and terrible chapter in their war. These men had learned to respect the danger posed by conventional anti-submarine aircraft. They knew that bombs and depth charges could kill them if they were unlucky or slow. They had developed procedures and tactics to minimize their exposure, surfacing only when necessary, maintaining vigilant watches, diving at the first sign of aircraft. But the Tsetse represented something qualitatively different, something that rendered their established defenses inadequate. This aircraft did not wound by chance or damage through blast effects. It killed through precision and overwhelming force applied in seconds. A single burst from the Tsetse's cannon could punch multiple holes through a submarine's pressure hull before the captain had even completed the order to crash dive. The armor-piercing shells, travelling at high velocity and designed to defeat tank armor, treated submarine hulls like tissue paper. They penetrated the outer casing with ease, punched through the pressure hull itself, and created catastrophic flooding that could not be controlled by any damage control procedures. To the men inside the submarine, the experience was apocalyptic. One moment they would be on the surface, engines running, feeling relatively safe. The next moment would bring a sound like the world ending, a metallic shrieking as steel tore and deformed under forces it was never designed to withstand. Gauges would explode as hydraulic lines severed. Water would spray through breaches with the force of fire hoses. Lights would die as electrical systems shorted out. Bulkheads would groan under suddenly unbalanced stresses. And all of this would happen in less time than it took to articulate what was occurring. One German submariner who survived an encounter with a Mosquito Tsetse later tried to describe the experience to Allied interrogators. His voice was hollow, his eyes haunted by memories that would clearly never leave him. "We feared the destroyer, yes," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "The destroyer could hunt us, could hurt us badly if we were caught on the surface or at shallow depth. But we cursed the wooden plane. We cursed it because it came too fast to see clearly, came too low for us to shoot at, and when its gun spoke, we were finished. There was no fighting back, no clever maneuvering to escape, no diving to safety. One moment we existed, the next we were dying." This personalization of warfare, this reduction of combat to intimate encounters between specific hunters and specific prey, was in some ways the most brutal aspect of the Mosquito Tsetse's deployment. The submarine was no longer an anonymous steel tube that might be destroyed by impersonal depth charges dropped from an aircraft whose crew never saw their victims. Instead, each encounter with the Tsetse was direct, personal, immediate. The pilot looked down and saw men scrambling on the submarine's deck. The submarine crew looked up and saw death diving toward them with a cannon that could not miss at such range. There was nothing abstract about this form of warfare, nothing that allowed either side to maintain psychological distance from what they were doing. The Mosquito Tsetse was not just a tool of war. It was a character in a grim drama, a wooden executioner armed with the teeth of a land weapon turned against targets on the sea. The contrast between the two combatants could hardly have been starker or more symbolic. On one side of this equation stood the U-boat, a marvel of German engineering representing the triumph of steel and mechanical precision. These submarines embodied decades of accumulated expertise in metallurgy, hydrodynamics, diesel and electric propulsion systems. They were designed to withstand crushing pressures at depth, to slip silently through hostile waters, to strike without warning and vanish before retaliation could be organized. They represented German confidence in technical superiority, in the power of advanced engineering to dominate the seas. Their crews were carefully selected and extensively trained, forming an elite within the already elite Kriegsmarine. They believed, with considerable justification early in the war, that they were masters of their domain, apex predators in the oceanic ecosystem. On the other side stood the Mosquito Tsetse, built not from steel but from wood, held together not with rivets and welds but with glue. This aircraft represented a different philosophy entirely, one that valued adaptability and innovation over raw strength, that trusted in speed and precision rather than armour and mass. Where the U-boat was a product of heavy industry and massive infrastructure, the Mosquito was built in workshops and furniture factories by craftsmen who normally made cabinets and tables. Where the submarine required specialised shipyards and enormous resources, the Mosquito could be produced in dispersed facilities that were harder for enemy bombers to target. The U-boat crew trusted in meters of steel to protect them. The Mosquito pilot trusted in being too fast to hit and too agile to catch. Yet it was the wooden aircraft, so much more fragile in appearance, that proved to be the dominant predator when these two weapons met over the Bay of Biscay. The irony was not lost on either side. German propaganda had long emphasized the superiority of German engineering and the power of steel and armor. British propaganda had sometimes struggled to explain why they were building major military aircraft out of wood when steel and aluminum were obviously superior materials. But in combat, none of that mattered. What mattered was that when the Tsetse dove on a surfaced U-boat and opened fire, the submarine was destroyed or crippled almost instantly while the aircraft flew away unscathed. The theoretical advantages of steel construction meant nothing when that steel was being torn apart by weapons it could not defend against. The tactical doctrine that emerged around the Mosquito Tsetse fit perfectly into the larger hunter-killer strategy that the Allies had developed. Ultra-intelligence and traffic analysis would identify areas where U-boats were likely to be operating or transiting. Radar-equipped patrol aircraft would sweep these areas, their sensitive equipment painting even small targets against the background of the sea. When a U-boat was detected, the information would be radioed to nearby strike aircraft. The Mosquitoes would then race to the area at high speed, using their superior velocity to intercept submarines before they could reach safety. Once visual or radar contact was established, the attack itself was brutally simple. Dive to low altitude, line up the shot, and fire the cannon at close range. No fancy tactics, no elaborate maneuvers, just raw firepower applied with devastating precision. For U-boat captains, every surfacing now became an exercise in terror. They needed to surface regularly to recharge batteries, to run their diesel engines and exchange the foul air that accumulated during hours submerged. But each time they broke the surface, they were gambling with their lives in ways that had not been true earlier in the war. Was the sky empty? Were they in a safe area far from Allied patrols? Or was there a Mosquito Tsetse circling above the clouds, invisible and inaudible, waiting patiently for them to present a target? The mathematics of submarine warfare had always involved risk calculations, weighing the need to move quickly and recharge frequently against the danger of surface detection. But now those calculations had changed dramatically. The old formula of "we can dive in 30 seconds and that's fast enough" no longer applied when the Mosquito could attack and cripple the submarine in less than 20 seconds. 18 seconds. That number haunted U-boat crews like a curse. 18 seconds was the amount of time between when a well-trained crew received the order to crash dive and when the submarine would be deep enough to be safe from most surface threats. 18 seconds from the first alarm to relative safety. But 18 seconds was also more than enough time for a Mosquito Tsetse to complete its attack run, fire a devastating burst from its cannon, and pull away, leaving nothing but wreckage behind. The margin that had once seemed adequate was now revealed to be desperately insufficient. The submarine's greatest defense, its ability to submerge and disappear, had been neutered by the arrival of a weapon that could kill before the dive was completed. This psychological dimension of warfare cannot be understated in its importance. War is not merely about destroying enemy forces and equipment. It is also about breaking the enemy's will to fight, about making them question whether continuation of the struggle is worth the cost. The Mosquito Tsetse achieved this psychological effect far beyond what its actual kill numbers might suggest. Even U-boats that never personally encountered the Tsetse knew about it, heard the stories from survivors, understood that this threat existed and could appear at any moment. The Bay of Biscay transformed from a challenging but manageable transit corridor into a region of nightmares, a place where surfacing meant potentially immediate death delivered by a weapon against which there was no effective defense. This fear, this constant psychological pressure, affected German operational effectiveness in ways that are difficult to quantify, but were undeniably significant. Crews became more cautious, captains became more reluctant to take necessary risks, and the overall aggressiveness and effectiveness of the U-boat arm declined partly due to this pervasive sense that the tide had turned against them. The Atlantic had become a theatre where contrasts defined the conflict. Steel against wood, with wood armed so effectively that steel offered no protection. Depth against sky, with aircraft able to strike submarines before they could reach the safety of the deep. The wolf against the fly, but the fly carried a cannon that could kill in seconds. The established order of nature seemed to have been inverted. The apex predator found itself being preyed upon by something that should have been beneath its notice. And in this inversion lay a lesson about warfare that transcends any specific conflict, that victory goes not necessarily to the strongest or the best armoured, but to those who can adapt most effectively to changing circumstances, who can innovate faster than their enemies can counter, who can see opportunities where others see only limitations. The wooden wonder, armed with a tank killer, represented exactly this kind of adaptive innovation, and its appearance over the Bay of Biscay marked the beginning of the end for German submarine dominance in the Atlantic. The night of December 23, 1943, began like so many other nights in the Bay of Biscay during that terrible winter of war. The waters stretched out beneath a sky that offered no comfort, only the pale illumination of a winter moon that turned the ocean into an expanse of silver and shadow. The temperature was well below freezing in the wind that swept across the exposed surfaces, the kind of cold that penetrated through layers of clothing and made men question why they had ever thought submarining was an acceptable profession. On the conning tower of U-128, Captain Werner Beck stood his watch with hands that ached despite thick gloves, raising binoculars to his eyes with mechanical regularity, even though he knew the chances of spotting danger before it spotted him were minimal at best. Beck was not a young man anymore, not by submarine standards. He had survived years of Atlantic patrols when so many of his fellow captains had not returned. He knew his boat intimately, knew every quirk of its machinery, every sound that indicated normal operation versus developing problems. He knew his crew, knew which men could be trusted in a crisis and which needed careful management. Most importantly, he knew the ocean and its moods, knew when to push hard and when to exercise caution. But even with all this experience, even with all his accumulated wisdom about submarine warfare, he was profoundly aware that the war had changed in ways that favoured his enemies. The comfortable certainty of earlier years, when U-boats had ruled the Atlantic almost unchallenged, had given way to a grinding anxiety that never quite left him even when safe in port. His batteries were dangerously depleted after hours of submerged transit. The electric motors that powered the submarine underwater drew current at a rate that could not be sustained indefinitely, and the battery banks were approaching a level where remaining submerged much longer would leave them unable to dive quickly if threatened. Inside the pressure hull, men gasped for air in an atmosphere that had grown increasingly foul as oxygen was consumed and carbon dioxide accumulated. The air recycling systems could only do so much, and there came a point where surfacing became not just operationally necessary, but medically imperative. Beck had reached that point and could delay no longer, regardless of the risks involved. "Crash dive on my command," he muttered to the lookouts who stood watch with him, a reminder of standing orders that needed no repetition, but that he felt compelled to voice anyway. The phrase was etched into the nervous system of every man aboard, had been drilled into them until it became automatic reflex rather than conscious action. He knew intellectually what the dangers were. He had read the intelligence summaries that described the Mosquito Tsetse and its terrifying cannon. He had heard the survivor accounts from other boats that had encountered this weapon and barely escaped with their lives. But he also knew he had no choice. Surface or suffocate, those were his options. He was gambling with death, but the alternative was certain rather than merely probable death. Above the cloud layer, unseen and unheard by anyone on the submarine, Squadron Leader Charles Anderson guided his de Havilland Mosquito through the night sky with the practiced ease of a man who had flown hundreds of hours in this aircraft. The Mosquito was his office, his workspace, the tool through which he contributed to winning the war. He knew its sounds and vibrations, could sense through the seat of his pants when it was flying properly and when something needed attention. The massive cannon in the nose was a new addition compared to standard Mosquitoes he had flown, but he had trained extensively with it and had come to appreciate both its power and the unique challenges it presented. The recoil was significant enough that firing the gun affected the aircraft's flight path, requiring immediate correction to maintain aim. The weight and bulk of the weapon shifted the Mosquito's center of gravity forward, requiring constant awareness of trim settings. But these were minor annoyances compared to the extraordinary lethality the gun provided. Anderson's radar operator sat beside him, eyes fixed on the glowing scope that painted a ghostly picture of the ocean below. Radar was still something of a black art, requiring interpretation and experience to distinguish genuine targets from wave returns and electronic noise. But the operator was good at his job, had spotted submarines before, and knew what a genuine contact looked like. When the pale phantom of U-128 appeared on the scope, drifting slowly on the surface as its diesels charged the batteries, the operator immediately called it out. Anderson acknowledged, his pulse quickening slightly but his hands remaining steady. This was what they had come out here for, what hours of patrol were meant to accomplish. The game was afoot. Banking hard, Anderson turned the Mosquito onto an intercept course and began descending through the clouds. Standard procedure was to use the clouds as cover for as long as possible, denying the submarine any warning of approaching danger. The element of surprise was crucial. If the U-boat spotted him too soon, it would dive before he could complete his attack run, and all the advantage of the Tsetse's cannon would be wasted. If he could remain undetected until very close, if he could pop out of the clouds almost on top of the target, he could get his shots off before the submarine had time to react. Time and distance collapsed as the Mosquito dove, its engines throttled back to reduce noise, its wooden airframe creaking slightly under the stress of the descent, but holding together as it always did. Breaking through the base of the clouds, Anderson immediately spotted the pale wake of the U-boat cutting across the dark water below. The submarine's deck was wet with spray, clearly visible in the moonlight that turned every surface into shades of silver and black. He could see tiny figures moving on the deck, the crew taking advantage of surface time to get some fresh air, to move about after being cramped inside the hull for so long. They looked so small from this altitude, so vulnerable, and for a moment Anderson felt the strange disconnect that sometimes affected combat pilots when they realized they were about to kill real human beings rather than abstract targets. But the moment passed quickly, professionalism and duty overriding sentiment. This was war. That submarine had probably sunk merchant ships, had probably killed sailors who were just as innocent as its own crew. There was no room for hesitation. He pushed the throttles forward and the Mosquito accelerated, engines snarling as they transitioned from cruise power to attack power. The wooden wonder transformed from a patrol aircraft into a dart plunging from the heavens, aimed with deadly precision at the target below. Anderson's hand tightened on the control stick, making tiny adjustments to keep the submarine centered in his windscreen. The cannon sight provided a simple reference point, and years of training had taught him how to judge the correct deflection angle and release point. Mathematics and instinct merged into a single calculation that happened below the level of conscious thought. On the bridge of U-128, a lookout had been scanning the sky with mechanical regularity, binoculars sweeping back and forth across assigned sectors. It was tedious work, straining to see details in darkness, trying to distinguish between clouds and aircraft, between stars and enemy planes. For long moments his sector appeared clear, nothing but empty sky and distant clouds. Then something changed. A shape resolved itself against the pale backdrop of the moon, a silhouette that was too solid to be a cloud and moving too fast to be anything but an aircraft. The lookout's training took over instantly, and he shouted the alarm with a voice that cracked from sudden adrenaline. "Aircraft! Aircraft!" Beck's head jerked skyward, his trained eyes searching for the threat. Against the moon he could see it clearly now, a twin-engine aircraft in a steep dive aimed directly at his boat. The sight triggered an instant recognition of danger that was almost physical in its intensity, a cold shock of fear that ran down his spine. that diving profile, that speed, that single-minded focus on his submarine, all of it screamed Mosquito Tsetse to his experienced mind. They had been caught in the worst possible position with the boat fully surfaced and vulnerable. "Alarm! Crash dive now!" Beck's voice cut through the night air with desperate urgency, the command that every submarine captain dreaded having to give but that Beck had shouted many times before. Klaxons began wailing instantly, their harsh electronic screech audible even over the rumble of the diesel engines. Men tumbled down the ladder from the bridge, feet slipping on wet metal in their haste to get below. Beck remained on the bridge for a few extra seconds, eyes fixed on the diving aircraft, trying to judge whether they would make it or not. The mathematics were simple and brutal. 18 seconds to dive versus perhaps 20 seconds until the Mosquito was in firing position. It was going to be desperately close. Inside the control room, the diving procedure unfolded with practiced efficiency. The diesel engines shut down with a mechanical clatter, their rumble fading to silence. Electric motors engaged to drive the propellers and maintain forward motion. Ballast tank vents opened with explosive hisses as compressed air was released and seawater rushed in to replace it, adding weight and destroying buoyancy. The bow tilted downward as forward tanks filled faster than aft tanks by design, giving the submarine the angle it needed to slide beneath the surface as quickly as possible. Steel groaned under rapidly changing stresses as the hull took on weight. Pressure gauges began to register increasing depth as the submarine slipped below the surface. But they were too slow. Time had run out in the way Beck had always feared it might. Anderson had lined up his shot perfectly, had judged the dive angle and airspeed and distance to target with the precision that separated successful pilots from dead ones. The ocean surged beneath the Mosquito's wings as Anderson pushed the nose down even further, descending to an altitude so low that salt spray from wave tops licked his windscreen. The cannon dominated his forward view, its long barrel seeming to reach out toward the target like an accusing finger. Every instinct and nerve was focused on this single moment, this brief window of opportunity when skill and training and preparation all came together. 18 seconds. That was the gulf between life and death that separated Werner Beck's command from survival or absolute destruction. For Beck, clinging to the bridge rail as his submarine tried desperately to claw its way beneath the surface, those 18 seconds stretched out like hours. For Anderson, lining up what would be the most important shot of his combat career, those same 18 seconds compressed into a single eternal instant. Time became elastic, simultaneous subjective eternity and objective blink. Anderson's thumb found the firing button, and he squeezed without hesitation. The Mosquito shuddered violently as the 57mm cannon roared to life, the sound thundering louder than the aircraft's own engines, a mechanical bellow that announced death was being delivered. Flame erupted from the barrel in a brilliant muzzle flash that lit up the nose of the aircraft. The automatic loading mechanism worked exactly as designed, chambering and firing shells in rapid succession. In just 1.5 seconds, a burst of armor-piercing rounds left the cannon at high velocity, crossing the short distance to the submarine in an eye blink. For Beck and his crew, the effect was absolutely apocalyptic, the end of their world arriving in fire and screaming metal. The shells struck the submarine's hull precisely as it began to slide beneath the waves, hitting the pressure hull at an angle that maximized penetration. Armor-piercing rounds that had been designed to defeat tank armor treated the submarine's steel like thin sheet metal. A metallic shriek echoed through every compartment as the pressure hull tore open under forces it was never designed to withstand. Gauges exploded in showers of glass and hydraulic fluid as lines severed. Water sprayed through multiple breaches with the force and violence of industrial cutting jets, icy seawater driven by outside pressure that was already significant even at shallow depth. The lights flickered once, then died completely as electrical systems shorted out under the sudden influx of conductive seawater. Emergency lighting kicked in after a moment, but the dim red glow only made the scene more nightmarish, illuminating chaos and destruction in bloody light. Panic erupted throughout the boat as men realized they had been hit and hit hard. "Flooding! Hull breach! Water in the control room!" The shouts came from multiple directions at once, voices raised in fear and desperation. Beck gripped the periscope housing, his knuckles white with tension, his mind racing through options that were rapidly collapsing to nothing. He had commanded U-128 for years, had taken it through combat and brought it safely home time after time. He had survived encounters that killed other boats, had outlived friends and rivals through a combination of skill and luck. And now, in just seconds, everything was ending. The proud predator was buckling under the assault of a single wooden aircraft. "Surface!" Beck roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Surface now!" Emergency blow. It was the only option left. They could not stay down, could not dive deeper, not with holes in the pressure hull letting the sea pour in. At depth, the water pressure would only force more water through the breaches faster, would overcome pumps and damage control efforts, would drag them down to crushing depths from which there would be no return. Their only chance, slim as it was, lay in getting back to the surface where the hull breaches would be above the waterline and the flooding might be controlled. Compressed air roared into the ballast tanks, forcing water out through the vents at high pressure, restoring buoyancy with desperate urgency. U-128 shuddered along its entire length, groaning and creaking as tortured steel strained under contradictory forces. Then it began to rise, surging upward in an emergency surface maneuver that was never meant to be graceful, only fast. White foam erupted as the submarine broke through the surface, forced back into the open air in shame and defeat. The boat wallowed in the waves, crippled and helpless, no longer a predator but merely a target waiting for the final blow. Men scrambled onto the deck as soon as hatches could be opened, some waving frantically toward the circling aircraft in gestures of surrender, others simply standing frozen in despair and shock. Someone found a white cloth, a shirt or towel, and waved it desperately. The universal symbol of surrender, the acknowledgement that resistance was over and mercy was being requested. The proud hunter of the Atlantic had been reduced to this, begging for its life from a wooden aircraft that had destroyed it in seconds. Above them, Anderson pulled the Mosquito away from the stricken submarine, banking hard and climbing back towards safer altitude. His job was complete. The weapon had worked exactly as designed, had proven its lethality beyond any question. U-128 was finished as a fighting vessel, even if it somehow managed to limp back to port. More likely, it would sink before reaching safety, joining hundreds of other U-boats on the bottom of the Atlantic. Anderson felt no particular triumph, no elation at the kill. He was a professional doing a necessary job, and this had been a successful engagement. That was all. For the crew of U-128, their war was over. Some would survive to spend the remainder of the conflict in prisoner-of-war camps. Others would die in the frigid waters of the Bay of Biscay, either from wounds or hypothermia or simple exhaustion. But all of them would carry the memory of those 18 seconds for the rest of their lives, the memory of how quickly everything could end, how thoroughly their steel fortress had been penetrated by a weapon they could neither defend against nor escape. The sea had taken yet another wolf, and the Mosquito Tsetse had added another victory to a legend that was already growing beyond the actual numbers involved. This engagement was not unique, not an isolated incident that happened once and never repeated. Instead, it was part of a pattern that repeated itself again and again throughout 1943 and into 1944, turning the Bay of Biscay into a graveyard for German submarines. Each attack followed roughly the same script. Intelligence or patrol aircraft would locate a surfaced U-boat, Mosquito Tsetses would be directed to the area, and the submarine would be caught in the brief vulnerable window when it was on the surface recharging batteries. The results varied in detail, but were consistent in outcome. Some submarines were sunk outright, their pressure hulls so thoroughly compromised that they went down within minutes. Others were damaged severely enough that they had to abort their patrols and return to port, effectively removing them from operational service for months while repairs were completed. A few managed to escape with minor damage, but even these encounters had psychological effects that lingered long after the physical scars healed. In August of 1944, a particularly successful strike demonstrated the devastating potential of coordinated Mosquito Tsetse attacks. A swarm of aircraft from RAF 248 Squadron caught 3 U-boats running together on the surface, apparently believing that travelling in company would provide mutual protection against air attack. This tactical decision, which might have made sense against conventional depth charge attacks, proved catastrophic when facing cannon-armed aircraft. The Mosquitoes dove on the submarines in sequence, each aircraft firing in turn to maximize the chances of hits while minimizing the risk of mid-air collisions. U-168 staggered under the first burst of shells, multiple rounds punching through its hull and creating immediate catastrophic flooding. The submarine began to sink almost immediately, water pouring in faster than pumps could possibly fight. Within minutes it had vanished beneath the waves, taking most of its crew with it. Only a handful of men managed to escape the doomed vessel and swim to the surface, where they clung to debris and waited for rescue that might or might not come. U-185 fared slightly better, but only slightly. Shells tore through its conning tower and into the forward compartments, creating damage that was extensive but not immediately fatal. The captain managed to get his boat submerged and began the agonizing journey back to port, nursing damaged systems and praying that nothing catastrophic would fail before they reached safety. The submarine did make it back to its pen at Lorient, but the damage was so severe that repairs took months and consumed resources that the increasingly desperate German war effort could ill afford. The third submarine in the group somehow escaped with relatively minor damage, though minor was a relative term when dealing with holes punched in a pressure hull. This boat also returned to port, its crew shaken and its captain writing a report that emphasized how helpless they had been against the Mosquito's attacks. One strike by coordinated Tsetse aircraft had effectively shattered an entire wolf pack, removing 3 submarines from operations in a matter of minutes. Even more strategically significant were the attacks on the refueling submarines, the specialized supply boats that the Germans called milk cows. These vessels were absolutely vital to extended U-boat operations far from French bases. Attack submarines could only carry so much fuel and so many supplies. To extend their patrol ranges into the mid-Atlantic and beyond, they needed to refuel and resupply at sea from these specialized vessels. The milk cows were larger and slower than attack submarines, less able to crash dive quickly, and represented incredibly valuable targets. Sinking or damaging a single milk cow could effectively strand dozens of attack submarines, forcing them to abort patrols early or limit their operational areas. U-488, one of Germany's vital supply submarines, found itself under Mosquito Tsetse attack while attempting to rendezvous with boats that needed refueling. Cannon shells ripped across its deck, killing crew members and starting fires that threatened the fuel and ammunition stored throughout the vessel. The captain had no choice but to break off the refueling operation and dive for safety, leaving the attack submarines he was supposed to service without the fuel they desperately needed. Those boats had to either return to port early or restrict their movements to conserve remaining fuel, reducing their effectiveness dramatically. Without the ability to refuel at sea, the operational range of the entire U-boat fleet shrank significantly, allowing Allied convoys to route around known German patrol areas with much greater confidence. The Germans gave the Mosquito Tsetse a name that captured both respect and dread. Das Holzkanonenflugzeug, the wooden cannon aircraft. Sometimes they simply called it Das große Kanonenflugzeug, the big gun plane. Neither nickname was spoken lightly or mockingly. This was not myth or rumour being circulated to scare inexperienced crews. This was real, a tangible threat that had killed submarines and submariners, a weapon whose existence had been confirmed by multiple survivors and captured documents. U-boat captains briefed their crews about it, warning them that if they encountered this particular aircraft, they had virtually no chance of survival if caught on the surface. The psychological impact of knowing such a weapon existed and could appear at any moment added another layer of stress to men who were already operating under enormous psychological pressure. For the crews who survived encounters with the Tsetse, the memories seared themselves into their minds with a permanence that no amount of time could fade. One former submarine officer, interviewed years after the war ended, tried to articulate what it felt like to be on the receiving end of such an attack. His words came slowly, as if speaking them caused physical pain, as if giving voice to the memories made them more real and therefore more unbearable. "You heard the roar of engines approaching very fast, much faster than you expected," he said, staring at something only he could see. "And then there was another roar, different, the sound of the gun firing, and then the sea itself screamed. That is the only way I can describe it. The ocean screamed as steel tore and water rushed in. Holes opened in the hull where no holes should be, in places that should have been strong enough to withstand anything. We knew then, in that instant, that it was finished. There would be no escape, no clever damage control, no nursing the boat back to port. We were finished. Another survivor tried to quantify the lethality of the weapon in more technical terms, but his underlying fear was still evident. From the moment the aircraft appeared until our boat was crippled and forced to surface took perhaps 20 seconds total. Maybe 25, if I am being generous with the estimate. In that time, our hull was penetrated in multiple locations, critical systems were destroyed, and we lost all ability to remain submerged. 20 seconds. That is faster than most of us could even process what was happening, faster than our training could respond to the emergency. It was not combat in any sense we understood. It was simply execution. The Mosquito Tsetse was unlike any other anti-submarine weapon deployed during the war. Depth charges bombed blindly, relying on blast effects and probability to damage submarines that might be anywhere within a considerable area. Conventional bombs scattered explosives into the depths and hoped for hits through volume of fire and good fortune. But the Tsetse aimed. It fired directly at the submarine with a weapon that could punch through steel as though it were paper. Every attack was precise rather than probabilistic. Every engagement was intimate rather than impersonal. The pilot looked through his gun sight and put shells exactly where he wanted them. The submarine crew saw death coming directly at them, aimed specifically at them, unavoidable and unstoppable. There was nothing abstract about this form of warfare, nothing that allowed psychological distance or emotional disconnection from the killing. The climax of this weapon's impact on the war cannot be measured solely in submarines destroyed or damaged, though those numbers were significant enough. The true measure of the Tsetse's effectiveness lay in the fear it instilled, in the way it changed German tactical behaviour, in how it contributed to the overall collapse of the U-boat threat in the Atlantic. Fear gripped every submarine captain who had to surface in the Bay of Biscay during 1944. They knew intellectually that most surfacings would not result in an encounter with a Mosquito Tsetse. They knew the odds were still in their favour for any single emergence, but they also knew that when the encounter did happen, they would almost certainly die. That knowledge, that certainty of doom if caught, affected decision-making in ways both subtle and profound. 18 seconds became a number spoken with almost superstitious dread in submarine crew quarters. 18 seconds from alarm to submergence, but 18 seconds was not fast enough anymore. That margin, which had seemed adequate for years, was now revealed to be desperately insufficient against a weapon that could kill even faster. Submarines had been designed around the assumption that 30 seconds on the surface represented an acceptable level of risk. But that assumption had been rendered obsolete by technological development, and there was no quick way to redesign submarines to dive faster. The boats the Germans had were the boats they would fight with, and those boats were now inadequate for the threat environment they faced. Steel screamed under the impact of armour-piercing shells. Wood prevailed through speed and firepower and innovation. and in those fleeting engagements that lasted less than half a minute from first contact to final destruction, the balance of power in the Battle of the Atlantic shifted definitively and irreversibly in favour of the Allies. The reign of the U-boat as master of the seas, as the weapon that truly frightened Winston Churchill, came crashing to an end not through any single decisive battle, but through accumulated losses and ever-increasing fear that made effective operations impossible. The fall of U-128 and the dozens of submarines that followed it to the bottom represented more than the destruction of individual vessels and the deaths of individual crews. Each sinking represented a crack in the foundations of German submarine warfare, a spreading fracture in the strategic edifice that Admiral Dönitz had built so carefully. Word of the Mosquito Tsetse spread through the submarine pens at Lorient and Brest and Saint-Nazaire with the speed of wildfire in dry grass. Men gathered in quiet corners and spoke in hushed voices about the wooden aircraft that carried a gun too large to believe. They told stories, each one more terrifying than the last, about hulls torn open in seconds, about crash dives interrupted before they could be completed, about watching helplessly as death dove toward them too fast to escape. These were not abstract tales told for entertainment. Every submarine crew included men who had served on boats that encountered the Tsetse and barely survived. Every patrol that returned from the Bay of Biscay brought new accounts of near misses and narrow escapes. The cumulative effect was devastating to morale in ways that official reports and propaganda could not counter. The comfortable arrogance of the early war years, when U-boat crews had believed themselves practically invincible, had been replaced by a grinding anxiety that never fully went away. Submariners had always known their profession was dangerous, had always understood that many of them would not return from patrol. But there was a qualitative difference between accepting calculated risks and living with the knowledge that an unavoidable death could strike from clear skies with no warning and no defence possible. Strategically, the impact rippled outward from individual engagements to affect overall German naval operations. The Bay of Biscay, which had been nothing more than a transit corridor early in the war, became a killing ground that submarines had to traverse with utmost caution. Coastal Command's patrols, now armed with both conventional depth-charge aircraft and the specialised Tsetse variants, turned those waters into a gauntlet where death waited patiently for any boat that spent too long on the surface. U-boats could no longer surface casually to recharge batteries or run on diesel engines at higher speeds. Every emergence had to be planned carefully, executed quickly, and terminated at the first sign of danger. The operational tempo of the entire U-boat fleet slowed as caution replaced aggression. The milk cow submarines, those vital refuelling vessels that extended the range of attack boats, became priority targets hunted with special intensity. Their destruction had cascading effects throughout the German submarine force. Attack boats that had planned patrols lasting weeks or months suddenly found themselves unable to reach distant operational areas or forced to return to port early when refueling became impossible. The strategic reach of the U-boat fleet shrank dramatically, allowing Allied planners to route convoys through areas that had previously been too dangerous to transit. Shipping losses declined accordingly, reaching levels that made clear the Allies were winning the Battle of the Atlantic after years of desperately close fighting. Admiral Dönitz responded to these developments with increasingly desperate measures that revealed how thoroughly the tactical advantage had shifted. He ordered his submarines to remain submerged as much as operationally possible, to avoid surfacing except under the most favourable conditions. He mandated use of schnorkel devices, breathing tubes that allowed diesel engines to operate while the submarine remained mostly submerged. These adaptations improved survivability against air attack, but they came at enormous cost to overall effectiveness. Submarines travelling on schnorkel were slow, clumsy, half-blind. They could not achieve the surface speeds needed to intercept fast convoys. They could not maintain the situational awareness needed for effective wolf-pack tactics. The hunters of 1942, those confident predators that had terrorised the Atlantic, had been reduced by 1944 to fugitives hiding in the very element they once ruled. The psychological toll on submarine crews cannot be overstated. These men were already operating in one of the most psychologically demanding environments imaginable. Submarine duty meant weeks or months spent in cramped, uncomfortable conditions, breathing air that was never quite fresh enough, unable to see the sun or feel wind on their faces, knowing that any mistake or mechanical failure or piece of bad luck could result in them being trapped at the bottom of the ocean in a steel coffin. Now, on top of all these existing stresses, they carried the burden of knowing that simply surfacing their boat might summon instant annihilation from the sky. One crew member's account, preserved in post-war interviews, captured this psychological burden with painful clarity. "We thought we understood fear before we heard about the wooden cannon plane," he said. "We feared depth charges, yes. We feared being trapped at depth with dying batteries. We feared equipment failures and navigational errors. But those fears were manageable because we had training and procedures for dealing with them. The Mosquito was different. There was no procedure for surviving it. If it found you on the surface, you were dead unless you were extraordinarily lucky." That knowledge sat in the back of your mind every single moment of every watch. We thought the sea had betrayed us by becoming transparent to radar. We thought even the air was against us because it carried the aircraft that hunted us. The ocean and sky, which should have been our allies, had become our enemies. The Mosquito Tsetse did not single-handedly sink hundreds of U-boats. Its direct kill count, while significant, was not enormous compared to other anti-submarine weapons. But this narrow focus on confirmed kills misses the larger strategic picture of how the weapon affected the war. The Tsetse's presence magnified the effectiveness of every other Allied weapon and tactic. It forced submarines to remain submerged where they were vulnerable to sonar-guided depth charge attacks. It made them reluctant to surface even when operationally necessary, reducing their effectiveness as convoy raiders. It consumed German resources as damaged submarines had to be repaired rather than new ones being built. Most importantly, it lived rent-free in the minds of U-boat crews, affecting their decision-making and aggressiveness in ways that no amount of official exhortation could overcome. Every captain who rose to periscope depth and then surfaced his boat carried a mental image of what might be waiting above. A flash in the sky resolving into a diving aircraft. The thunder of a cannon that sounded like the end of the world. The scream of steel being torn apart by shells moving faster than sound. This image was always present, always influencing calculations about when to surface and for how long and under what conditions. The cumulative effect of thousands of these small decisions, each one slightly more cautious than it might have been without the threat of the Tsetse, added up to a significant reduction in German submarine effectiveness. By late 1944, the statistical evidence told a story that German Naval Command could not ignore. Convoy losses had fallen dramatically from the dark days of 1942. Allied merchant shipping tonnage was increasing as American shipyards produced vessels faster than they could be sunk. U-boat kills, conversely, had mounted to levels that were genuinely catastrophic for the Kriegsmarine. Wolf-pack tactics, which had once allowed coordinated attacks by multiple submarines to overwhelm convoy defences, had been reduced to isolated and increasingly desperate strikes by individual boats. The tactical doctrine that Dönitz had developed so carefully, that doctrine of mass attack and coordinated action, had simply collapsed under the weight of Allied countermeasures. The Atlantic sea lanes that had once bled Allied shipping in quantities Churchill described as frightening now flowed relatively freely with convoys of men and supplies feeding the build-up for the invasion of Europe. The material that crossed those sea lanes would eventually become the armies that stormed the beaches of Normandy, the supplies that sustained those armies as they pushed into Germany, the fuel and ammunition that kept the war machine running until final victory. The Battle of the Atlantic had been won by the Allies, and while many factors contributed to that victory, the Mosquito Tsetse had played a role that far exceeded what its modest production numbers might suggest. In the aftermath of the Tsetse's deployment and success, the legend of U-boat invincibility was thoroughly broken. The wolves of the deep had discovered that they too could be hunted. that their steel construction and sophisticated design did not guarantee survival, that the ocean they had once dominated had become their grave. More devastating still was the discovery that their nemesis was not some massive weapon system requiring enormous resources and advanced technology, but rather a simple concept brilliantly executed. Put a big gun on a fast aircraft and use it to shoot submarines before they can dive. The weapon that accomplished this was not made primarily of steel, the material of industrial might that Germany had trusted to win the war. Instead, it was constructed largely of wood, that ancient and supposedly obsolete material that modern warfare had supposedly rendered irrelevant. The irony was brutal and inescapable. The Third Reich had built its military pride and propaganda around advanced technology and industrial superiority. German engineering was supposed to be the best in the world. German weapons were supposed to be the most advanced and most effective. Steel and precision machining and sophisticated design were the hallmarks of German military equipment. Yet here was a critical battle in the war being won by the British with an aircraft held together with glue made from plywood that furniture makers understood better than aircraft engineers, armed with a weapon that was effective precisely because it was simple and straightforward rather than sophisticated and complex. The Wolfpacks were finished as an effective fighting force by the end of 1944. Individual submarines continued to operate, continued to sink the occasional merchant ship, continued to tie down Allied resources that might otherwise have been deployed elsewhere. But the strategic threat they represented, the possibility that they might actually strangle Britain and force a negotiated peace, that threat had been eliminated. The ocean was no longer their domain where they moved with impunity. Instead, it had become their grave, a vast cemetery holding the wrecks of hundreds of submarines and the bodies of tens of thousands of submariners who never returned home.